the devil's rocking chair. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when we first saw the chair. My wife, Sarah, and I were exploring a quaint, forgotten antique shop nestled on the outskirts of town. The shop was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, with dusty shelves stacked high with relics of the past. Sarah had always been drawn to antiques, believing each piece held a story waiting to be discovered. That's when we found it, the rocking chair. The chair was positioned in the corner, almost hidden beneath layers of old quilts and knickknacks. It was made of dark, polished wood, with intricate carvings that seemed to twist and coil like serpents. Despite its age, the chair looked oddly pristine, as if it had been preserved from the ravages of time. Sarah was immediately captivated. "This is perfect for the nursery," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I wasn't so sure. There was something about the chair that unsettled me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Still, wanting to make her happy, I agreed, and we purchased it for a bargain price. The chair was delivered the next day, and we placed it in the nursery. Our baby was due in a few weeks, and Sarah had spent countless hours decorating the room. The rocking chair fit perfectly, adding a touch of old-world charm. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things. It started with small, almost imperceptible movements. I would leave the room, and when I returned, the chair would be in a slightly different position. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. But then, the noises began. Late at night, I would hear the unmistakable creak of the rocking chair moving on its own. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the baby monitor. But as the nights wore on, the creaking grew louder, more insistent. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the chair creaking more violently than ever before. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and made my way to the nursery. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the chair rocking furiously, as if an invisible force was pushing it. I threw open the door and rushed inside. The chair stopped abruptly, its sudden stillness more unsettling than its previous movement. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. That's when I noticed something else. On the backrest of the chair, barely visible in the dim light, were deep scratches, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the wood in a fit of rage. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the jagged edges. This was no ordinary rocking chair. The next day, I decided to confront the shop owner. When I asked him about the chair, his face turned ashen. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "That chair," he said slowly, "has a dark history. It once belonged to a family involved in a notorious exorcism. They claimed the chair was possessed by a malevolent spirit. After the exorcism, the family got rid of it, hoping to rid themselves of the evil that plagued their home. Chilled to the bone, I returned home, my mind racing. How had we brought such a cursed object into our home?" That night, I told Sarah everything. She was skeptical at first but agreed to move the chair to the basement until we figured out what to do with it. But the chair had other plans. That night, as we lay in bed, the temperature in the house seemed to drop. A cold, unnatural chill permeated the air. I heard the creaking again, louder this time, echoing through the halls. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement. As I descended the stairs, the creaking grew louder, almost deafening. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, and there it was, the chair, rocking violently, as if possessed by some unseen force. I watched in horror as the chair lifted off the ground, hovering for a moment before crashing back down with a bone-chilling thud. I ran back upstairs, my mind reeling. This was no ordinary haunting. The chair was a conduit for something far more sinister, something that wouldn't rest until it had claimed its next victim. And as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. The chair had brought something into our home, something dark and violent, and it wasn't going to leave without a fight. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing dread. The chair, now banished to the basement, seemed to exert a dark influence over the entire house. Sarah tried to remain calm, focusing on the upcoming arrival of our baby, but I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Sarah suddenly dropped her fork, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened, straining to catch any sound. At first, there was nothing but the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a baby crying. We both rushed to the nursery, but the room was empty, the crib undisturbed. The crying continued, echoing through the house, growing louder and more desperate. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the sound was coming from the basement. We stood at the top of the stairs, paralyzed with fear. "We need to get rid of that chair," Sarah said, her voice trembling. I nodded, knowing she was right, but the thought of going down there terrified me. The next day, I made arrangements to have the chair removed. I called several junk removal services, but each time I mentioned the chair, the response was the same: silence, followed by a hurried refusal. It was as if the very mention of the chair repelled people. Desperate, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with a sledgehammer and a can of gasoline, I descended into the basement. The air was thick with an oppressive cold, and the smell of decay hung in the air. I approached the chair, my heart racing, and swung the sledgehammer with all my might. The chair splintered under the force of the blow, but as the pieces scattered across the floor, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The basement seemed to darken, the shadows lengthening and deepening, as if something was waking up. I fumbled with the gasoline, dousing the remains of the chair, and struck a match. The flames roared to life, illuminating the basement in a flickering, eerie light. But instead of feeling relief, I was overcome with a sense of dread. The shadows seemed to move, writhing and twisting like living things. Suddenly, the flames sputtered and died, snuffed out as if by an unseen hand. I backed away, my mind reeling. The chair, or whatever malevolent force inhabited it, was far from defeated. That night, the terror escalated. As we lay in bed, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing the hallway outside our room. The door creaked open, and I saw a dark figure standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I reached for the lamp, but it wouldn't turn on. The figure moved closer, and I could see its twisted, gnarled face, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her close, and together we prayed for it to go away. Just as the figure reached the foot of the bed, it vanished, leaving behind an icy chill that seemed to seep into our very bones. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too terrified to sleep. The next morning, we knew we had to seek help. We reached out to Father O'Malley, a local priest known for his work with exorcisms. When he arrived, he took one look at the house and immediately sensed the darkness that had taken root. Father O'Malley spent hours blessing the house, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every corner. When he reached the basement, he paused, his face grim. "This is where it's strongest," he said, his voice heavy with foreboding. As he began the exorcism, the temperature in the basement plummeted. The walls seemed to close in, and a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows twisted and wreathed, forming grotesque shapes that clawed at the walls. Father O'Malley's prayers grew louder, more urgent, as the darkness fought back. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and the roar ceased. The basement fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. "It is done," Father O'Malley said, his voice weary. "But be warned, this evil is not easily vanquished. It may return if given the chance." With the exorcism complete, we hoped our ordeal was over. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness still lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, as we lay in bed, I felt a cold breeze brush against my face. I opened my eyes, and there, at the foot of the bed, was the rocking chair, whole and untouched, swaying gently back and forth. The realization that the chair was back, unharmed and more malevolent than ever, sent us into a spiral of despair. Sarah and I knew that our options were limited and that conventional methods were useless against such a powerful evil. With nowhere else to turn, we decided to contact the only person who might have a deeper understanding of the dark forces at play, an old family friend and occult expert, Professor Elias Thorne. Professor Thorne arrived within hours, his presence bringing a sliver of hope. His weathered face and piercing eyes spoke of a lifetime spent battling the supernatural. As he examined the chair, his expression grew grim. "This isn't just a haunted object," he said. "It's a conduit for something far darker, something demonic." Professor Thorne explained that the chair had been used in a ritualistic exorcism gone wrong, trapping a powerful demon within its wood. The exorcism's failure had bound the demon to the chair, allowing it to wreak havoc on anyone who owned it. Destroying the chair alone wasn't enough. We needed to sever the demon's connection to our world. "We must perform a counter-ritual," Thorne said, his voice steady. "One that will banish the demon back to the hell from which it came. But be warned, this will be dangerous." Desperate and with no other options, we agreed. That night, as a storm raged outside, we prepared for the final confrontation. Thorne set up a circle of protection in the basement, surrounding the chair with symbols and candles. He handed Sarah and me small talismans to ward off the demon's influence. As Thorne began the ritual, chanting in an ancient tongue, the air grew thick with an oppressive, malevolent presence. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting in unnatural shapes. Suddenly, the chair began to rock violently, as if an unseen force was trying to break free. Thorne's chanting grew louder, more urgent, as the demon fought back. The room filled with a deafening roar, a sound so horrific that it shook the very foundations of the house. Then, the basement door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The shadows coalesced into a dark, twisted figure, its eyes burning with a hellish fire. It lunged at us, but the circle of protection held, the demon unable to cross the barrier. "We must hold our ground," Thorne shouted over the roar. "Do not break the circle." As Thorne continued the ritual, the demon's fury intensified. It lashed out, sending objects flying across the room. The candles flickered, threatening to extinguish, but Thorne's voice remained unwavering. With one final, powerful incantation, Thorne thrust his hands towards the chair. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the demon let out an ear-piercing scream. The shadows wreathed and twisted, then began to dissolve, sucked back into the chair as if drawn by an invisible force. The light grew brighter, almost unbearable, and then, with a final burst, it vanished. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifted. The chair lay in pieces, burnt and charred, the demon's hold on our world finally broken. Exhausted but relieved, we helped Thorn to his feet. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The demon is banished." We thanked Thorn profusely, knowing we owed him our lives. As we emerged from the basement, the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting a warm glow over the house. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, we felt a sense of peace. In the days that followed, we began to rebuild our lives, the horrors of the past weeks slowly fading into memory. The nursery was transformed, the lingering darkness replaced by the light and love of our growing family. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside was still, I sometimes heard a faint creaking sound, like the whisper of a distant memory. And though the chair was gone, its ashes scattered and the demon banished, I knew that some things could never be truly forgotten. For we had looked into the abyss, and it had looked back. And in that dark, twisted reflection, we had seen the true nature of the evil that lurked in the shadows. And that, dear listener, is the story of the devil's rocking chair. Remember, some relics of the past are best left undisturbed, for they hold the power to bring forth nightmares that no exorcism can ever truly vanquish.